Right now, 3 checks tied to your Social Security number are sitting untouched, and the reason has nothing to do with what you actually earn. Prices keep climbing. Groceries cost more than they did last year. Utility bills arrive higher every summer, and Medicare premiums just went up again in 2026. Through all of that, you have probably assumed that a handful of federal assistance programs exist for people poorer than you. That assumption is the single most expensive mistake in retirement finance right now, because the income lines moved this year, twice actually, and almost nobody went back to check. Here is what nobody tells you plainly. One of these 3 programs functions as a genuine second monthly payment, completely separate from your regular Social Security check, and most people who qualify for it never file the paperwork, not because they are denied, because they never apply. They rule themselves out in their own head based on a number they remember from years ago, a number that Washington has already changed since then, sometimes more than once. Stick with me through all 3, because the third one on this list is the one almost nobody rechecks, and it might be the one worth the most to you personally. Let's start with the program most people have heard of, but almost nobody understands correctly: Medicare Savings Programs. Most seniors think Medicare Savings Programs are one single benefit. They are actually 4 separate programs stacked on top of each other, each with its own income line, and each paying for something different. Understanding the difference between these 4 is the difference between correctly ruling yourself out and incorrectly leaving money on the table. The first and most generous tier is called Qualified Medicare Beneficiary, or QMB. If your monthly income sits at or below $1,350 as a single person or $1,824 as a couple, this tier pays your Part A premium if you have one, your Part B premium, every deductible, and every coinsurance payment, not some of it, all of it. If you have QMB and a provider bills you anyway for a Medicare-covered service, that billing is illegal under federal law, full stop, and you can report it to your state Medicaid office or to Medicare directly. The second tier is Specified Low-Income Medicare Beneficiary, or SLMB. The income line moves up to $1,616 for a single person, $2,184 for a couple. SLMB covers your Part B premium only, not deductibles or coinsurance. But that premium now runs $202.90 a month in 2026, up nearly 10% from what it was in 2025. Covering that alone puts roughly $2,400 a year back into a fixed income budget. The third tier, Qualifying Individual, or QI, stretches further still, up to $1,816 for a single person, $2,455 for a couple. It also covers the Part B premium, but unlike QMB and SLMB, QI is funded through a capped federal grant rather than an open-ended entitlement. Dates is handed out first come, first served, and you have to reapply for it every single year. If you got QI last year, that does not carry forward automatically. There is a fourth program, Qualified Disabled Working Individual, or QWI, but it applies narrowly to people under 65 who returned to work after a disability and lost their premium-free Part A as a result. Most retirees won't fall into this category, but it's worth knowing it exists if it applies to someone in your family. Now here is a detail almost nobody mentions when they explain these income lines, and it changes the math for everyone watching. Those numbers already include what's called a general income disregard. Before your income gets compared against any of these thresholds, Social Security subtracts $20 automatically. That means your real gross income can run $20 higher than the published limit, and you would still qualify. It sounds small, but for someone sitting right at the edge, $20 is sometimes the exact difference between approval and denial. And one more thing that catches people completely off guard. These federal numbers are floors, not ceilings. Individual states are allowed to set their own limits higher, and some do it dramatically. Massachusetts, for example, extends its version of QMB, which it calls senior buy-in, all the way up to 190% of the federal poverty level, roughly $2,527 a month for a single person, with no asset test at all. Connecticut runs limits even higher than the federal floor across all 3 tiers. If you live in one of these states and Googled the national number, you may have wrongly ruled yourself out of a program your own state runs far more generously than the rest of the country. Now let's talk about who actually uses these programs, because the popular version of this story is wrong, and getting it right changes where you should be looking. You will hear the claim, repeated across dozens of videos and articles, that roughly 1 in 3 eligible people never enrolls in a Medicare savings program. The real research tells a sharper and more useful story. Looking at data from 2018 through 2020, the actual participation gap nationally was closer to 43% unenrolled, not 33%. And it is not spread evenly across the 3 tiers. Enrollment in QMB, the most generous tier, runs around 53% of those eligible. SLMB drops to 32%. QI, the tier reaching furthest up the income scale, sits at just 15% enrolled among those who qualify for it. Read that again slowly. The program built for people earning the most among those still eligible for help is the one almost nobody claims. That is not an accident of psychology alone. QI carries a real administrative burden layered on top of the confusion, capped annual funding, first-come-served processing, and a requirement to reapply every 12 months instead of staying automatically enrolled the way QMB and SLMB recipients usually do. Two forces are working against QI applicants at once, one psychological and one bureaucratic, and together they explain why this exact tier has the lowest participation of the three. Let's make this concrete with a full worked example, because seeing the actual math is the only thing that reliably changes someone's mind about whether to apply. Picture a retired widow, 73 years old. Her Social Security survivor benefit runs $1,500 a month. She also draws a modest pension of $150 a month. Add those together and her gross monthly income is $1,650. If she had Googled Medicare Savings Program income limit and stopped at the first number she saw, QMB's $1,350 limit, she would have concluded correctly that QMB is out of reach. Most people stop exactly there. That is the mistake. But apply the $20 disregard first. Her countable income becomes $1,630. That number clears SLMB's limit of $1,616 by exactly $14, so SLMB is actually out too, just barely. But it comfortably clears the bar for QI at $1,816, with over $180 of room to spare. She would never have found that out from the first headline number she read. She had to actually run her own math against all three tiers, not just the first one she stumbled across. Once approved, her Part B premium of $202.90 a month disappears from her deduction entirely. That's $2,400 a year, money she had been quietly losing every single month for years without knowing an alternative existed. I've noticed something while looking at how people actually interact with these programs, and it's worth pausing on directly. People do not check their eligibility once and then stay wrong forever because the system deliberately tricked them. They check once, land on a single number, usually the strictest tier's number because that's the one that shows up first in search results, and then they stop checking entirely, even as their own income, their state's rules, and the federal poverty guideline all keep moving independently of each other every single year. The habit of checking once and filing it away as permanently settled is, on its own, quietly costing people more money than almost any other single detail in this entire video. There is a second layer to Medicare Savings Programs that almost nobody explains, and it multiplies the value of everything I just walked through. The moment you're approved for any tier, QMB, SLMB, or QI, you are automatically enrolled in something called Extra Help, formerly the Part D Low Income Subsidy. You do not file a second application. There is no separate form. It happens behind the scenes, triggered entirely by your MSP approval. Extra Help is not a small add-on. The Social Security Administration estimates its average annual value at $5,700. It caps your prescription drug copays at $5.10 for generic medications and $12.65 for brand name drugs for the entire calendar year, regardless of what your Part D plan would normally charge. For many enrollees, it also eliminates the Part D premium and deductible completely if you're enrolled in what's called a benchmark plan. And if you weren't previously enrolled in Part D at all, Extra Help removes the late enrollment penalty you'd otherwise carry for the rest of your life. Think about what that means in total. One approval for one program silently activates a second program worth thousands more per year, and the person applying for the first one very often has no idea the second one is coming. That's not a footnote. That's the single most undercommunicated fact in this entire space. Now let's move to a program almost every senior has heard of, and almost nobody has actually rechecked recently. LIHEAP, the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program. Say that name out loud to most people and they picture one thing: winter. Heating bills, cold months, a check that arrives sometime around December. That picture is only half correct, and treating it as the whole picture is exactly why people miss money that's available to them right now, in the middle of summer. LIHEAP is actually structured around 4 separate components, and not every state runs all 4. There's heating assistance, the one everybody knows, covering natural gas, electricity, oil, propane, or wood during the cold months. There's a separate cooling assistance component for air conditioning costs during summer heat, which some states offer and others don't. There's crisis assistance for emergency situations like an imminent shutoff or a fuel tank running below 20% capacity, which processes faster than standard applications, sometimes within 24 to 48 hours. And there's weatherization assistance, which pays for insulation, window sealing, and furnace repairs that reduce your energy costs permanently rather than covering a single season's bill. Federal law sets the income ceiling at up to 150% of the federal poverty level, or 60% of your state's median income, whichever number is higher, with a hard floor that states cannot set below 110% of the poverty line. Translate that out of policy language for a second. This program reaches meaningfully higher up the income scale than most people assume when they hear the words low-income assistance. If you've been earning modestly more than the federal poverty line and assume that disqualified you, in most states it does not. And critically, many states run their summer cooling window as a completely separate application period from winter heating on its own calendar, with its own opening and closing dates. Georgia's 2026 Cooling Assistance Program opened April 1st specifically for residents 65 and older and the medically homebound, a full month ahead of the general public opening on May 1st. States build that kind of early window deliberately because they know older adults face the highest health risk from summer heat and historically the lowest awareness that cooling assistance exists at all. Other states run entirely different calendars. Alabama's cooling window in 2026 opened May 1st and stays open through the end of September, a long runway. Hawaii's window is much tighter, opening June 1st and closing at the end of that same month. Nebraska's summer program runs June through August. There is no single national date. Your state's window is the only one that matters to you, and it might already be open right now while you're watching this. Here's the mechanic almost nobody explains clearly. This benefit does not arrive as a check mailed to you. It goes directly to your utility provider as a credit against your account. That's often exactly why people don't realize they received it. There's no dramatic windfall moment. There's just a bill that quietly runs lower than you expected the next time it arrives. Benefit amounts typically range between $200 and $1,000, depending on your state, your household size, and your fuel type. And one more thing state agencies are unusually blunt about: this money runs out. It is distributed first come, first served, and multiple state programs state outright in their own public materials that funding is typically exhausted before the season technically ends. That is not a scare tactic designed to rush you. That is the literal operating mechanism of the program. Applying in July instead of waiting until September is not simply a preference. In a first-come, first-served system, it can be the entire difference between funded and waitlisted. If any part of what I just walked through applies to you or to someone you love, here's the most useful thing you can do before finishing this video. Subscribe now, because I track exactly when each state's cooling window opens and closes, state by state, all year, and that calendar shifts constantly enough that catching it after the fact usually means catching it too late for this season. You've made it more than halfway through this video, and that tells me something specific about you. You're the kind of person who double checks a number before writing it off completely instead of accepting the first headline you saw. That exact instinct is what gets people paid money they already legally qualify for. Keep that instinct running through what comes next, because this last program is the one I promised you back at the very beginning. Here's the second check I mentioned at the start: Supplemental Security Income, or SSI. This is where the confusion runs the deepest, so let's be precise about what makes it different from everything else we've covered. Your regular Social Security retirement benefit is based on what you personally paid into the system across your working life through payroll taxes. SSI is something else entirely. It is a separate, means-tested cash payment administered by the Social Security Administration but funded differently, designed specifically for people whose income and resources fall below a strict federal line, regardless of their work history or how much they paid in over the years. You can receive both your regular retirement benefit and SSI at the same time if your regular benefit is low enough. For a meaningful number of retirees, that combination functions as an actual second monthly deposit landing in their account. The 2026 federal benefit rate after this year's 2.8% cost of living adjustment is $994 a month for an individual, $1,491 for a couple. If your countable income falls under that line, SSI pays you the difference between what you currently have coming in and that federal floor. It is not an all-or-nothing cliff. It fills the gap. The resource test is where people talk themselves out of even applying before they try, so let's walk through it carefully. The limit is $2,000 in countable resources for an individual, $3,000 for a couple. Those numbers sound impossibly tight for anyone who has managed to save anything at all, and they have not moved since 1989. But the exclusion rules matter enormously more than the raw dollar figure, and this is exactly the spot where people disqualify themselves incorrectly inside their own heads before ever speaking to anyone at Social Security. Your primary home does not count toward that $2,000 limit, no matter what it's worth on paper. One vehicle does not count, no matter what it's worth. Household goods and personal belongings don't count. A designated burial fund up to $1,500 doesn't count. And if you or a family member qualifies for an ABLE account, up to $100,000 held in that account is excluded entirely from the SSI resource count. What the Social Security Administration is actually measuring is liquid cash and investments you could convert quickly, not your overall net worth as a homeowner with a paid-off car in the driveway. The income side works as differently for earned versus unearned income, and understanding the earned income math specifically can change whether working part-time in retirement makes financial sense. Social Security disregards the first $20 of any income you receive that month. Then, specifically for wages from work, it disregards an additional $65. After both of those exclusions, it counts only half of whatever earned income remains. Let's run the actual numbers. Say you earn $1,600 in a month from part-time work. Subtract the $20 general disregard, then the $65 earned income disregard, and you're left with $1,515. Cut that in half. $757.50 counts as your countable earned income. Since that's below the $994 federal benefit rate, you would still qualify for SSI, just at a reduced payment. Your maximum benefit minus that $757.50, leaving you roughly $236.50 a month on top of what you earned from work. Run your own numbers through that same formula, and you may find you qualify for a partial payment even with income you assumed was too high. I want to step outside the raw mechanics for a moment, because there's a pattern here worth naming directly rather than just describing the rule. An asset limit frozen at exactly $2,000 since 1989, never adjusted for inflation a single time in over 3.5 decades, isn't simply an inconvenient bureaucratic detail. It functions in practice as a quiet exclusion mechanism that pushes out precisely the people this program was designed to help. Anyone who managed to keep even a modest emergency cushion instead of spending every dollar down to nothing. There are bipartisan bills sitting in committee in Congress right now, including one called the Savings Penalty Elimination Act, that would raise that limit to $10,000 for an individual and $20,000 for a couple, with backing from organizations spanning the political spectrum, from ARP to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. As of this year, none of them have received a floor vote. Until one does, the number that governs your eligibility today is the one on the books right now, not the one advocates are asking Congress to pass. Now let's connect everything you've heard in this video, because there's one mechanism underneath all three programs that explains why last year's no doesn't necessarily mean anything this year. The $202.90 Medicare premium, the $994 SSI floor, the LIHEAP income ceiling. All three of those figures reset every single year, and they're all tied, directly or indirectly, to the federal poverty level, which the Department of Health and Human Services republishes every February based on the prior year's inflation data. In 2026 specifically, Social Security applied a 2.8% cost of living adjustment, its fifth straight year at 2.5% or higher, the longest such stretch since the 1990s. That adjustment raised benefit checks, but it also simultaneously reset every income ceiling tied to the poverty guideline across every program we've discussed tonight. Here's the part that almost nobody explains, and it's the single most actionable fact in this entire video. If you were denied for Medicare Savings Programs LIHEAP or SSI last year at your exact same income with your exact same assets, you can be newly eligible this year without a single dollar changing in your own financial life. The line moved towards you. Nobody sends you a notice announcing that shift happened. There's no letter that arrives saying you might qualify now. You have to go check it yourself actively every year because the government will not do it for you. That is the actual story sitting underneath all three of these programs. They were never designed to be secret. But no state agency runs an advertising budget for its own benefit programs, while scam warnings and fraud alerts dominate every search result and every nightly news segment covering senior finances. The result is a strange kind of imbalance. Seniors are extremely well warned about people trying to steal from them, and almost entirely uninformed about money the government itself is actively trying to hand them. If there's a fraud happening in this story at all, it's the quiet kind, the fraud of ruling yourself out before anyone ever actually asked you a single question. So here's my honest position on all of this. The barrier standing between you and these three programs was never really eligibility. It was the assumption that you already checked once, and that checking once was enough for the rest of your life. I want to hear something directly from you. In the comments, tell me the actual year you last checked your own eligibility for any of these three programs, And be honest with yourself about whether you assumed the answer would be no before you ever looked into it. I have a strong feeling the answers in this comment section are going to prove exactly the point I just made to you. Here's what to actually do this week, in order. Call your state Medicaid office and ask specifically about Medicare Savings Program income limits for 2026, not whatever number you remember from a previous year. Contact your state's LIHEAP office directly and ask whether summer cooling assistance is currently open in your state right now. And call the Social Security Administration at 1-800-772-1213 or visit ssa.gov and ask directly whether you qualify for SSI under this year's federal benefit rate. 3 phone calls, under 30 minutes total. These numbers that reset every single year whether you check them or not, and this year they may finally be resting in your favor.